Syria has now been at war for 7 years, and, if anything, it's getting worse. Peaceful protests turned into a civil war, but, and this is the key to understanding what's really going on, that civil war has now morphed into something else, a conflict of global dimensions playing out within Syria. In a second, we'll explore why, but first, who is involved? Well, you've still got the forces of President Bashar al-Assad. He's backed up by Russia, as well as Iran, and various powerful Shia militias. Then you've got the rebels. Now they've been taking an absolute battering, but are still fighting on. Two of the biggest are called Jaish al-Islam and Ahrar al-Sham. Up in the north are the Kurds. They're an ethnic group that are spread right across the region, and now hold large areas of the north of the country. They're allies of the US. There's also Turkey, which is fighting Kurdish forces, and Israel, which is launching airstrikes in the south. And finally, the Islamic State group, the fanatical jihadists who took over large parts of Syria and Iraq, grabbing the world's attention with their brutality. They've lost almost all their territory, but are still a threat. But if you really want to understand what's going on in Syria, you need to know why people are fighting. Since the very start, President Assad has had one objective: staying in power. And he's been prepared to do pretty much anything to achieve it. Although he denies it, the West has accused him of war crimes. From indiscriminate bombing to using chemical weapons, his forces are thought to have been responsible for most of the conflict's deaths. Assad's main target has always been the groups that he calls terrorists, but most others call rebels. They share one aim: to overthrow him. But in truth, that's really all they have in common in many cases. They started fighting after the government's brutal crackdown on peaceful protests back in 2011. And at first they included army defectors, members of civil society. But as the war has ground on and got more brutal, many of them have been pushed out or killed. Lots of the groups still fighting are now hardline Islamists. Finally, as I mentioned before, you've got the Kurds in the north. There's more than 20 million of them across the region, but they've never had their own state. Understanding that is crucial to understanding the Kurds. Soon after the start of the war, Kurdish forces took control of the area they call Rojava. That's after the government pulled out. Their main fight is for autonomy and against IS. But one of the reasons Syria is such a mess is because it's become a proxy war for international powers. So why did they get involved? Well, President Assad is Russia's closest ally in the region. If he fell, Russia would lose its key foothold in the Middle East. It would also lose Tartus, its only Mediterranean port. It could not let that happen. For Iran, this was partly about supporting an old ally. But more than that, it was about countering the influence of their regional rival Saudi Arabia and spreading their own influence across the region. The consensus is that in achieving their goals, both Russia and Iran have outplayed everyone else. While the US, Turkey and the Gulf states offered some support to various rebel groups, Russia and Iran decided not only that they wanted Assad to win, but that they would make sure he did. Against Russian air power and Iranian-backed militias, the rebels have been badly outmatched. Now, no one is seriously talking about Assad being forced to give up power. The US always said it wanted him to leave, but never took decisive action to actually make it happen, maybe as it feared what would replace him. The rise of IS with their gruesome propaganda was a far more straightforward enemy, and became the focus. The US worked with, trained and armed a group called the Syrian Democratic Forces. Although they're mostly made up of Kurdish fighters called the YPG, they were crucial in driving IS out of northeastern Syria. One of Turkey's main roles has been giving shelter to millions of Syrians fleeing the conflict, but they've also supported a rebel group called the Free Syrian Army and are accused of funding jihadists. Turkey also fears Kurdish autonomy in Syria as it thinks it would fuel separatism in Turkey. And so it's launched a war against the YPG, who it says are terrorists. Although remember, the YPG are the same fighters who are armed by and allied with the US. As a consequence, Turkey, a member of NATO, is now working closely with Russia. Down south, Israel's main concern has been the growing influence of its arch foe, Iran, and high-tech weaponry getting in the hands of Hezbollah. And so a global conflict plays out within Syria's borders, with Russia now calling the shots. The war in Syria is as complicated and bloody as ever. People are still dying, lives are still being torn apart, and the nation, global powers, and most importantly, the people of Syria are being drawn further into a situation that it is hard to see a way out of.